Supply chainers, wherever you are in the world, this is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey with you today. Are you ready? Let's talk supply chain. Hello, supply chainers. I am super excited to be back here with you today for Thoughts and Coffee. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I am the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, the Blended podcast, and now the founder of the Blended Pledge, which we will talk about in just a little minute. I hope that you are having a great week so far. We have a super exciting show for you today because Lora Cecere is joining me as our guest to talk about how we screwed up planning, and we're going to get right into that. But we could not have this show without our sponsors. You just heard from Fastenal and what they're doing in supply chain. Now, Emerge is proud to partner with Thoughts and Coffee to elevate our combined focus on empowering and growing meaningful relationships in the freight industry. The first and only freight-specific RFP platform, Emerge is reinventing freight procurement by offering solutions that enhance the spot and contract procurement process, enabling shippers to make the most strategic decisions possible, saving invaluable time and enhancing productivity. Learn more at emergemarket.com/thoughts and coffee. All right, we've got a big show to get into, so let's talk about what is happening at Let's Talk Supply Chain right now. So we've got a brand new episode for you, Make Freight Intelligent with Pando. Nitin. Now, I had this conversation with Nitin just a little while ago, and let me tell you, his energy and his passion for supply chain and making freight intelligent is palpable. We had an amazing conversation talking about their story, how they're helping their customers. So go and check that out. It's episode 273. Wherever you subscribe to the show, you've got Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Amazon. We are all over that. Plus, you can go and find out more at letstalksupplychain.com as well, under listen. So that is our episode for this week. We've also got some upcoming events. So what do we have? So Manifest isn't happening until January, but we're already talking about that. So go and check it out. They've already got some speakers lined up and some vendors. So go check them out. And of course, we're going to be talking more about Imagine today with Lora Cecere. This is her conference happening September 6th through 8th in Washington. I'm going to be live on site hosting the digital portion of that particular event, and I cannot wait. I have seen the agenda, and you do not want to miss a second of this. So go and check it out. We are going to put the link to that in the comments throughout the show so you can go and register. What else have we got? We've got action items with DC Shrigola. That happens every second Friday. LogTech Live. Eric goes live twice a month with us now at Friday at 10 a.m. Plus, we've got Intelligent Automation Week in Chicago. That is happening July 27th through 29th in Chicago. Go and check that out. Plus, this week we've got No Bullshipping with Hope White, and I am going to be on Coming In Hot on Thursday with Abby Baird. We're going to have a great conversation about what's happening with the next generation of supply chain, and I can't wait for that. So awesome. We've got so many amazing events. Plus, we've got Blended. We've got a brand new episode out. It's episode 21, and I am talking to everybody about why you should be retaining diverse talent. This was an amazing conversation with some really great folks coming together and talking about what that actually looks like. Plus, they even questioned each other. So go and check that out. And if you didn't know, for the Blended Pledge, our applications are open. So we have 3 spots right now to give away grants to diverse voices that want to say yes to speaking engagements. So if you have a speaking engagement coming up and you want to say yes and you want to get your travel expenses covered, go and check out our application process because we can definitely get you there. Plus, the other thing that I want to talk about is we are going to be at the home delivery show at the end of August as well. I'm going to be podcasting live on site. So if you're going to be there, let me know. If you're an organization that wants to get on our podcast, let us know. I'm going to be podcasting on site. I'm also going to be doing the same at Manifest as well. Plus, we have a new announcement coming up about ships that you're not going to want to miss. I just recorded the episode. It is going to come out in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that too. All right, without further ado, it is time to bring Lora up to the stage. Hello, Lora. How are you doing?
Awesome. Rock and roll, Sarah.
I am so excited to have you here. I'm so excited to be collaborating with you on Imagine. I cannot wait because, like I just said in the introduction, we're working on this agenda and it's amazing, both digitally and in person. And so you can't go wrong with this conference. But before we get into a little bit more of that, why don't you give everybody a bit of an introduction? There's not a lot of people that don't know you, but for those who might not, let's do that.
So my name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. I've been an industry analyst for 22 years. People who say I'm a consultant say, you just don't understand Lora. Consultants know the answer, and Lora is trying to figure out the questions. So I write for the early adopters, primarily in manufacturing, some in retail, and I try to help people to understand new technology approaches and rethink, what we're doing, because we've got a lot of it all wrong.
Absolutely. And I love all of the ways that you think about supply chain, your passion for supply chain. I mean, like you said, you come up with the questions that we all need to find out the answers to. And it's really a collaborative approach, which, if anybody knows me, I always say collaboration is the future of business. So they know that is a good fit for me. So, one of the things that I came across recently that I wanted to talk to you about, because this ties in really, really well to the Imagine conference. Makeup giant Revlon filed for bankruptcy protection, citing its debt load and supply chain challenges. Now, when I saw this, obviously there's been a ton of disruptions. Obviously, supply chain professionals are tasked with so much, but it really made me think about the content and what we're going to be talking about at Imagine. And really the title of this, which we're going to get into a little bit later on about how did we screw up planning. But this one in particular, what is happening out there that a makeup giant like Revlon would file for bankruptcy because of supply chain challenges?
I've been writing about this for a while. Revlon is not going to be an anomaly. And let's talk about why. We've gone through a lot of mergers and acquisitions without really looking at the basics of supply chain. And I think we've made three really critical errors. One is we treat all products the same without designing and looking at the rhythms and cycles of the supply chain. Two, we've not managed complexity, so if you look at Revlon, 30 to 50 different ingredients going into the package. And, third, we've really focused on financial reengineering, elongating payables, pushing cost and waste back in the supply chain, not managing inventory. And, now suppliers have the power. So when you can't keep payables long and you got to bring them in, you got to do a better job of managing the supply chain. And Revlon just didn't have what it took.
Which is just crazy to me. And, if I'm in the audience as a small to medium-sized business, you take a look at Revlon and you're like, well, if they can't do it, what the hell am I trying to do? You know what I mean? So what would you say to them?
Well, I'm working on the Supply Chains to Admire report right now, which is an analysis of 29 industry sectors over the last decade. And I got to tell you, Sarah, the smaller companies are doing better than the larger companies, which is surprising, right? So Clorox is outperforming Procter & Gamble. A lot of times people think Procter & Gamble is the be-all in supply chain. A company like Intuitive Surgical does better than Becton Dickinson and medical device. On and on. And so in all the sectors, it is the smaller companies that are getting it right. And let me tell you what getting it right means. They're aligned. The gaps between finance and operations are small. And so the role of finance is not the big sheriff in town that is doing a lot of financial reengineering. Second, they're managing complexity because that long tail of the supply chain is horrible, particularly with the higher inventories in transit and the large bullwhip effect that we've got going on coming out into the inflation recessionary periods. That bullwhip effect is just huge. And three, they're not focused on IT standardization and IT outsourcing. They understand the power of innovation and they're driving innovation forward. So, I love supply chain and I like seeing what it takes to win.
Well, and we're going to be talking about case studies like this at Imagine. Can you give us kind of a little glimpse as to what people can expect from coming to this conference?
Yeah, so Imagine is designed to help people to unlearn from the past, to rethink, to prepare for Supply Chain 2030. And, I don't pull any punches. I handpick every speaker on stage. And, the goal is for us to really think about what we're doing and how we do this better and to embrace the art of the possible. So it starts out with industry sector leaders talking about how they envision Supply Chain 2030. So the head of the Cleveland Clinic is there, a woman from Bank of America that's worked on corporate social responsibility investing is going to talk about ethical labeling and what's going to be happening in corporate social responsibility labeling and why we should care. Someone from the semiconductor industry is going to talk about the future of tech. And so then we get into the supply chains to admire discussion and look at who's done things well, and we hear from their voices. 3 different case studies on stage, and they haven't all confirmed yet, so I can't tell you their names. And then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about technology advancements. I've got a company talking about unstructured text mining and listening posts and how that transformed customer service. I've got a company talking about no-code unified data models that allow how can we really get at data that is different and get over this issue around clean and pristine data and kind of the barriers of integration to look at portability. We're going to be talking about outside-in processes. And, I love the work that we're going to be working with you on the River of Demand, where we've got 20 companies that show how demand doesn't flow in their organization because we've put demand into relational databases, and we talk about how we need to make data perfect versus how do we build demand visibility systems that allow people to see, interpret, and act on the demand signal. And then we're going to be talking about how do we build the winning organizations, because I think there's a lot to learn from the lack of alignment and the redefinition of work.
Yeah, and there's a lot to learn from each other. What I really love about your approach is it really is collaborative, right? Between the audience, the speakers, yourself, and just sort of bringing everybody together, asking the right questions, but having the conversations to be like, okay, what do we need to do to get there? What does that look like? What are you doing? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And that's how we're going to get to the future of supply chain. And I love that. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Imagine a little bit later on because you had a really great article that we're going to be talking about as well. But first, we do need to get into our poll of the week before we get into our articles. Now, the question that we asked you, what do you think most attracts the future of supply chain to future roles, which is totally what we're talking about today. And we were surprised, right? 43% said company's culture imprint, another 43% said salary and benefits. 6% of you said vibe of the interview, and 8% of you said easy application. Now, one of the reasons why we asked this question is because we keep hearing about this talent shortage. Keep hearing about the next generation of supply chain coming into the industry and what they're actually expecting from us, right? Or organizations that they're working for, and what are they looking for. And so we wanted to ask you to really find out. We had 524 votes. Now, Lora, does this surprise you? What do you think about this? What are you kind of hearing in the industry about, talent and how important these things are?
So I've done many talent studies and I don't see much change. That it's really about work and the design of work and the culture and how people feel. And is the work meaningful? Yes, salary is important. And yes, work-life balance is important. But unfortunately, we've designed work so that baby boomers are more satisfied than younger employees,
Yeah.
that can't really get to data. Their technologies don't work for them very well. They spend lots of time in meetings. We don't design meetings very well. And so I'm all about redesigning work and really the culture of the company.
Yeah, and the culture really is key. I mean, we talk about it all the time, and some people are like, well, culture, culture, culture. Okay, but how do we do that? Right. And I think it really comes down to being your authentic self, looking at people holistically for who they are, not just what they can bring to the table from 9 to 5, because really, essentially, 9 to 5 is kind of out the window. We're flexible working. That's what people want. They want to be able to do a variety of things during their day. Excuse me. And if 8 o'clock at night is their peak working hour, they want to be able to do their best work at the time that works for them. And so I think when we talk about culture, it's really just looking at every single avenue. And I want to bring up our first article because it really has to do with what we're talking about today. So I don't know if you guys saw a couple of weeks ago, Stored got this huge funding of 120 million. And then they laid off 8% of their workforce. And they're talking about, I mean, we're hearing all about talent shortages. And then we see stuff like this, and they're not the only ones. There's a bunch of VC backed companies in supply chain that are laying people off at the moment. And it's kind of like, what are we doing? We've got a talent shortage on one side. We're hiring too many people and then laying them off. I mean, what is that saying to the industry? What is that saying to the next generation of supply chain? What did you think when you saw this, Laura?
Well, I think we're in a venture capital explosion where we're not necessarily putting our money where it's smart on the redefinition of supply chain processes. It's sort of like in the early 2000s when, everything was a network, and I was tracking 217 different network models when I was at an analyst firm. And, so we go through these booms and busts, and we're on this kind of boom and bust of changing the last mile. But how can we change the last mile if we don't have reliability in the first mile? And the new forms of commerce in that last mile are being challenged by the lack of reliability on that first mile, and the fact that we've never had variability on that first mile like we have today, and our systems aren't ready for it. So I'm not surprised. I've got a lot of venture capitalists that I think are investing not wisely in the market. Supply chain is hot and sexy. So good for you, Sarah. You're in a sexy space, but I don't think we're doing things that we should when it comes to the redefinition of where we put our money to change these business models.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that on 2 points. One is the last mile. So I read this morning that a company called Joker got $430 million, and they're shutting down in the US because they base themselves on 15-minute delivery, and they're losing $159 an order. So that's another company that's taken a massive amount of investment and hasn't been able to make it work. And so you talk about last mile delivery being really the last point that we should be focusing on, and we're not putting enough emphasis on that first mile. So case in point, that's a case study right there. And then Emma Cosgrove in this particular link, she has an article as well, and she's talking about how founders are now saying that they need to focus. They need to turn their funding into good business. And to me, isn't that the point from the very beginning? Like, why else would you take money? Why are founders all of a sudden saying, well, we've taken this money, we need layoffs so that we can focus to make good business?
Well, but the question is, without reliable first mile and without a good perpetual inventory signal, why are we defining these, right? The venture capitalists are really, drunk on supply chain right now, but I don't think most of them understand it. And so middle mile, first mile ventures, yeah, tough slog until we get this straightened out.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I loved about what Emma said is that this industry rallies behind those people that are laid off and helps them find new jobs. I love that because supply chain is all about people. And if somebody is looking at our industry and noticing that about the people within our industry, I mean, in a conversation that's kind of dire, that's the light that's being shone, really, and that we need to focus on.
Right, and I'm followed by about 327,000 people on LinkedIn, and probably some of the most popular posts are when I reshare that somebody is looking for a job. And I actively try to help people to find jobs, right?
Mhm.
Particularly in the area of planning. So I think that's true. We help others. And I think it's part of our DNA.
Yeah, I did that just the other day. I heard of some layoffs somewhere else as well. I reached out to them, said, "Are you okay?" First of all. Second of
Mhm.
all, how can I help you? And I think, it just really goes to show. I love that because that's my favorite part of this industry is people. All right, let's get to our second article because this is probably one of the most important ones out of the three today. So you wrote this article back on the 1st of June. When it comes to planning, how we screwed up planning. This is what we're talking about today. This is the title of the article. This is why we're coming together in September. So, talk to us about this. Walk us through what this article really talks about and how did we screw up planning?
Well, we screwed up planning in a number of ways, right? So I'm just going to give you a little background, Sarah, about my experience in planning to kind of set the stage. In the 1980s, I was running manufacturing and distribution centers. I had no idea what planning was. And then I went to work for a planning company, and I'm like, oh, I'm so far behind. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, we made the models simplistic because of technology limitations. Who knew that that basic taxonomy and framework that we built in the 1980s, the 1990s would still be in existence in 2020, right? Many decades later. And people have focused on that saying it's end-to-end planning, but it isn't, right? So the second point is there is no common data model between the models and the taxonomy and planning. DRP is very different than TMS. Transportation looks at the lowest price, assumes that transportation is available. Distribution requirements planning is looking at the consumption of the demand signal for safety stock. We're not really looking at form and function of inventory. There are many models that aren't really connected on a unified data model. That's number two. Three, because of the fact that we've not embraced the art of the possible, looking at alternative ways of doing this, whether it's an ontology or a graph, but instead we've pushed everything into relational databases, which means that the data needs to be very clean, and everybody argues that the data is not clean enough, right? Because we're using the wrong technology. And then we take the output and we try to get very precise on imprecise data without really understanding why do we plan.
Yeah.
And, I love this quote from Eisenhower. It's not about planning itself. Planning is always wrong. It's about the fact that planning helps us to really bring people together to understand the trade-offs and what can happen. And, 90% of people do not have a feasible plan because they're focused on tight integration or they're focused on reaction, and they don't understand the value of planning. Now you're showing the inventory numbers, and many times, I go to conferences and speak, Sarah, and one of the first hands is, well, didn't we screw up the supply chain because of VMI? Absolutely not, right? We screwed up the supply chain because we are not good at managing inventory. We have on average 37 more days of inventory in the supply chain today than we did in 2007. And you might say, why, right? In-transit inventories grew, right? All of that inventory on the containers on the ship is on our books. All of the inefficiencies in transportation cause that in-transit inventory to be high. Also, cycle stock inventories grew because we made the product portfolio more complex, adding to the cycles in manufacturing. We outsourced 29% on average to contract manufacturers, which increased the lead time, which increased the inventory. And only 9% of companies actually design their supply chains. And, I'm a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of school without designing distillation columns and heat exchangers, never use that. But I'm like, how can we be running supply chains that we inherit and don't design and actively design and really inform the engines? In addition, we have this planning group that's sort of like the old-fashioned typing pools, right? This group of people that are working with the engines that have 2 to 3 years of experience, right? We need to democratize planning and really empower business leaders to use the tools and redefine the planning role.
Yes.
And that's what this conference is all about, is how do we go outside in? How do we use new forms of analytics? How do we blow up existing taxonomies? And I'll put case studies on the stage that talk about value.
Well, and give them the space and time to be able to do that. Right?
Right?
I feel like business leaders aren't necessarily giving that space and time that supply chain professionals and supply chain managers and leaders really need to be able to do that, and what that can actually do for their business into the future. One of the things that I'm super excited to learn a little bit more about at Imagine is this unlearning. Can you talk
Mhm.
about, because I think that's a little bit scary for some people, right? Is how do we unlearn what we've already done? And depending on where you are in your journey, it can be overwhelming, potentially, it can be exciting. Talk to us a little bit more about that unlearning and how that's kind of really a goal for Imagine this year.
So I work with a lot of manufacturers, and they'll say, well, it's a change management issue. And I say, we can't really tackle change management unless we unlearn. And we have to learn from the past, unlearn. And unlearning is fundamentally hard because it challenges your current paradigm of how do you define technology, how do you define processes. And you have to come to grips with the fact we don't have best practices. And so we have a couple of exercises to help really jumpstart the unlearning. One is we got a backwards bike, and people might say, well, it's easy as riding a bike. Well, not if you change the relationship between the gears and the handlebars, right? And that's an analogy about what we need to do in planning. The second thing is we'll have the river demand room where 20 companies will show their supply chain and really show the fallacies of what we're doing today. Our demand should be a river, and in today's supply chain, the river gets dirty and constrained very early because of lots of mistakes we've made. And so we're going to talk about those. And you're going to hear the voices of the people that drew the images. And I don't think anyone's going to walk out of that room saying we have best practices, or we need to invest in current technologies, or we don't need to redefine work. And I'm all about redefining work because our millennials and our younger students are not happy in the workplace, and we owe it to them to give them a fun, dynamic place to work.
Well, and get our hands dirty. You're going to have something there that I'm super excited about, that people can actually touch and feel and really take that analogy home. So now we've only just got a couple of minutes left, and I do want to just touch on one more article, which is about the fact that we've got 10 weeks worth of wheat left. And a lot of this they're talking about has come to not only a production issue, but also a supply chain challenge with the war over in Ukraine. And so I want to ask you just quickly, what's your advice to supply chain professionals in food supply chain right now? Because we're seeing shortages everywhere and they're kind of firefighting on a daily basis. So what would you say to them?
Yeah, so I wrote about this 7 months ago to get ready to look at, what are we doing in wheat and what are we doing in other commodities? And I think that it's time for what I call bidirectional orchestration, which looks at alternate bill of materials, perhaps substitutes for wheat, looks at, how do we manage complexity? We've got a lot of waste in that supply chain, as I showed with inventory. Should we reduce the product portfolio so we can better use the commodities that we have? And, how do we manage with the farmers and the relationships with what's happening in agriculture to try to alleviate this, right? Because unfortunately, the food producers, as we've gone through a lot of M&A, have become adversarial with the farmers, and we really need to take that issue out. One of the big worries I have is water, particularly as it comes to food instability. I'm reading a number of articles where we're X number of days from zero water in Africa. Well, the combination of the lack of wheat into Africa and the lack of water is going to cause a lot of migration and instability. And I was in California last week, and one of the speakers talked about how 5 trees had died around her house because of the lack of water. We need to get serious about corporate social responsibility, and that I can talk about for hours, but thank you for having me today.
Well, we are going to talk about it, and I hope that we see all of you at Imagine in person, digitally. Can't not wait. Thank you all for joining us. Lora, it's always such a pleasure. You're going to be back with us probably in about a month or so. And so I wish everybody have a great week.